Okay, Nazli, where are you? There you are.
Well,
You're
this
you're
has
on. You're on.
this has been a really very, very interesting and very rich 50 minutes or whatever we have done. And I must say, I greatly appreciate what has been said so far. But I also would like to say that just before this discussion, um, Ambassador Raghavan and I had an email exchange, and I do support his rephrasing or all changes in the text that I have proposed. I have proposed on behalf of the Boston Global Forum and the Michael Dukakis Institute. Um, there are two points I'd like to make before we get straight to the framework. The first is that almost everybody agrees about the salience of AI, but I don't think we appreciate how deeply it penetrates, has already penetrated all of our societies in all sectors everywhere. And this is simply a footnote to what the speakers have said so far. My second point, and then we'll get to the framework, is we are the in between generation. We're the only generation that got into the AI, understands the dilemmas, and as we move on, it's our responsibility to leave some kind of regulatory framework before the younger generation that has not had the Cold War experience, the World War One, World War Two, etc. experience. If we can just organize for them a framing of action and a framing of discourse, it would be a major contribution that could be considered, our generation's contribution. Footnote here: I think that the Boston Global Forum and the Michael Dukakis Institute did not intend to exclude the non-democracies. I think we reinforce the democracies a tad bit or lots of tads too much. Uh, but the intent is somebody's got to stop this going, especially that the Europeans have given us many important anchors, one of which has not been discussed, brought up today, that I'd like to mention, which is the Budapest Convention on Cybercrime. Um, Imagine if there were a competition on the best use of AI by criminals, and then we honor the criminals. I'm not taking that seriously. I'm just saying that we have already in place foundational material, in addition to what has been said so far, that we should utilize. So onto the framework. We look at it. We've developed it into four components. The first has to do with the preamble, which reflects the premises or the assumptions, and those have been mentioned today. The second is the design of the framework. What does the architecture look like? Measures, the third is measures that really we should take, and those have to be discussed, altered, changed, etc. Um, and then a support system needed in the course of articulating, developing, and moving from framework to something like a global regulatory framework. I think there's nothing that I have to tell you or can tell you that you don't know, but we may organize it a little bit differently. So on the preamble, which is the premises, how we get into this, um, we begin by recognizing, of course, the acceleration of AI penetration in societies. And we begin with the importance of recognizing the power of the precautionary principle that the international community has already agreed to. And it's one of the contributions in the climate change debates. Related to this on assumptions, of course, commitments to human rights are essential. We take that for granted. Um, but at the same time, we have to highlight the domain of responsibilities. Rights and responsibilities more or less come together. Maybe the responsibilities are more institutional or national, but that's still a responsibility issue. And then, of course, the added premise or value or assumption has to do with recognizing the diversity in the international community. It's a very banal statement to say we are a very diverse international community. Regretfully, it's essential to keep that in mind. So now let me move to the basic architecture, a framework design, if you wish. And because it's a framework, um, its elements can be altered. And because it's a framework, the details of the elements, such as they are now, can also be improved. Basic design is multi-stakeholder, balance of influence and responsibility across all participants, and respecting national authority and international commitments. This is just a repeat of what has been said so far, but perhaps in a less elegantly than what we've said so far. So there's some tasks are required, some things we have to do uh, to consolidate our discussion into a viable draft framework. I'll just mention one or two. I won't go through the list, all of the list. And that is pulling together the legal frameworks in countries that address the AI issues. Many countries do so indirectly by putting it under some other technological category. And another essential task required for consolidating the draft is to be explicit about the norms, reinforce the norms, and as had been said by our speakers earlier today, articulate the introduction of new norms that are essential to support the regulatory um, framework. Um, Ambassador Raghavan justly noted the use that I did in talking about constructing a sanctions system. Of course, incentive system would be much better. Withdrawing incentives uh, could be a little bit painful, so we keep that in mind. Now, on the things that have to happen, the next element, which is measures to be taken. Um, we talk about starting with the individuals, we talk about individual rights, individual responsibilities with respect to what? Question mark. And here the framework suggests that included in the rights and the responsibilities is rights to digital and rights to AI related education. The younger generation in place at the moment already has basic foundations that our generation didn't have when we got into the digital areas. And the right to avoid digital damages, a right. And then that comes responsibilities, which you can imagine what they're like. We've articulated them, but it's a question of how pragmatic we can be. Moving on to the measures to be taken for national policy at the national level, because ultimately um, we do want governments to be encouraged or willing to adopt a certain set of provisions and operate on them. One example is to provide education for all citizens or all individuals in their jurisdictions um, through real or online with advanced AI technologies. Every country has an educational system, of course, but not every country targets itself to do some technology leapfrogging, which is quite possible now, given the tools that we have. Another national imperative for national policy, and this one is very dicey, and I think we are open to framing it in any way we think is better, to protect intellectual property rights. Now, I'm really sorry to have to raise this. This is one of the elements that are difficult to finesse worldwide. Now, let me move on to measures to be taken among states, good, bad, or indifferent states, democratic or otherwise. Part of the dilemma is how to get everybody onto roughly the same wavelength for discussions. And one strong type of action to be taken, measure to be taken, is to develop common principles to combat or restrain misinformation. I recognize the dilemmas there, but it's impossible to keep, or it's difficult to keep management of misinformation or the role of misinformation outside this discussion. And then we ask of the United Nations and international organizations, of course, their support system, and of course, leadership in developing, are formalizing a global digital ethics. There are bits and pieces all over the place, as you have mentioned, but what has to be done is to be kind of create a holistic ethics design out of what we now have, some of which have been already um, mentioned. Moving on to the business entities, there are quite a few things that we would like them to consider or that we expect of them. Again, a little dicey. For example, to enable audits for transparency, to really respect transparency when it comes to potential application of AI with damaging correlates. And to participate enthusiastically in the adoption of common AI standards across the board. And then finally, when it comes to what else would we like as measures, these are all measures, part of the framework, from civil society. Civil society is always put at the very end of any list. But civil society really is the ultimate arbiter as to whether something will work or will not work. And we expect civil society to be involved in the process by making its own requirements known and by supporting institutional mechanisms to accelerate involvement of younger people into the types of debates that we are having. So this ends the measures to be taken in general. The details of the framework are embedded in what I've articulated so far, the details as much as we have gone through. But what I'd like to conclude with is, when all is said and done, there are a set of we have to think about a support system to support the process that we are going through now. We're just talking about the beginning of a framework, a global framework, but we need a support system to help us through this. And the proposal here is to keep in mind the anchor, which would be the precautionary principle, but in terms of specific elements of a support system to keep us working through this, a code of ethics. The sooner we can get to the code of ethics, the better. We also suggest the establishment of a multidisciplinary international scientific community, commission that acts autonomous to provide independent review of where we are at, where we are going, and what innovations that are on the horizon could be thought of as good test cases for our own thinking. Almost every country has a scientific community, a commission of some sort, operating to support government activities. But in this case, as we move on from a very skeletal framework with some principles, etc., to filling it and articulating and developing consensus around core operation principles, it is imperative to have with us, or have as part of the initiative, is a scientific commission, call it whatever one wishes. Ultimately, we'll have to demonstrate a proof of concept. If we have a concept, it makes sense, etc. All right, what's the test for it? How do we know that we're on the right track or not on the right track? And at this point, I'm out of my depth here, but I would say that if we bring this question from the global question level down to the very, very, very local, and no more local than a city, then it's also very useful to keep an eye and to learn from the IWS city initiative that is going on now. Et voilà, that's about all I have to say. And I thank you for your patience.